Thank you so much, Demola, for the opportunity, and a very warm welcome to the session. Ekaro, Jumbo, welcome. I'm working on my understanding and application of Yoruba because I'm incredibly passionate about Nigeria, West Africa, and Africa as a continent. My name is Oliver Nathan, and as Demola mentioned, I am the head of learning at Africa People Advisory Group. We are a fairly boutique HR consulting firm, and we do our work primarily in Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, Zimbabwe. We do a little bit of work in South Africa, but I think for myself and for the consultancy that I apply my trade for, we are incredibly passionate about the continent and the real massive potential and pockets of expertise that exist on the continent. So again, I really encourage your participation in the session. If you want to say something, feel free to interrupt me as we go through the session. If you have any questions, keep them to the end, but I'd love to have you contribute in this discussion that we're going to have, really around looking at the relationship or the what we'd like the relationship to potentially be between how an organization sets its corporate strategy and what our strategy should be as learning and development as a department within a business to be able to really speak to that strategy. And well, why is this important? I think it's absolutely critically important that we allow that opportunity for the learning and development strategy or approach or goals to really speak to what the organization is trying to achieve as a whole. So I think for me, a really, really important topic, and we often don't think of learning and development in really strategic ways. And we'll move on to this idea as we work through the slides. But really what we are seeing here is that changing role of learning and development in the strategy making process within organizations. So there are various different organizations who are really getting this right, for example, Microsoft. And on the other hand, you get organizations who are not getting this right, where learning and development or training and development or your training department is just seen as an order taker. So a line manager will come to you and say, for example, oh, we need sales training for our business development people, not understanding or knowing whether that particular training intervention is actually tying into the strategic objectives of the organization. Or we need to do a team building event. I come to L&D and I say, we need to do a team building event. That's our request. Please, L&D, put it together for us. That's a particularly sort of reactive and very transactional way of doing learning and development. And it happens in organizations. It really, really happens where learning and development is not yet well developed enough to sort of stand on its own feet and to be able to ask the question, okay, so you want to do a team building event, but firstly, how does that dovetail into what the organization is trying to achieve as a whole, as per its strategy? And that is the topic of today's discussion. It's to try and give you some tips and pointers in terms of how do we put together a learning and development strategy, A, and B, how do we align the learning and development strategy with the overall goals and objectives of the organizations in which we work? So a very, very important topic, I believe, at least. So again, yes, feel free to interrupt me, stop me at any point, and I would be happy to let you contribute to the discussion as it goes on and as it unfolds. All right, so in my last presentation, if this is your first presentation, you might not have seen this individual on your screen, but if you were at my last presentation, which we did, I think, at the beginning of December last year, I introduced you to a gentleman by the name of Josh Burson. And Josh Burson has a lot of really, really good and important things to say about learning and development. I wanted to start my presentation off really with a quote from him, talking about the importance of learning and development as a means for an organization to effectively execute on its strategy. So he says, strong clearly articulated strategy with common goals, languages, and processes are crucial to keeping employees and teams in step with one another. We know this. This is what strategy is supposed to achieve. The responsibility for making sure that the shared strategy is broadly understood and applied is increasingly falling to learning and development and HR professionals. An incredibly important quote. And Josh Bersin and the Josh Bersin Academy has done an absolute fortune of research on this particular topic. So I think a good suggestion is to research, go onto Google, and start to understand some of the amazing work that Josh Bersin and the Josh Bersin Academy do in this particular space. He's definitely a hero of mine. I wanted to start us off with first, what is an understanding of what corporate strategy is? Corporate strategy is really that opportunity to answer two questions, right? There's a lot of myths and misconceptions around what a corporate strategy actually is. I've got my own opinion. This is a particular definition of strategy that really works for me based on my experience. The gentleman that you can see on your screen is incredibly well known in strategy circles. And if a business has a strategy committee or a planning committee, they'll probably know who this individual is. His name is Michael Porter from Harvard Business School. And his view on what strategy is that corporate strategy concerns two different questions. What businesses is the corporation in? And how the corporate office should manage the array of business units. Sounds quite complicated. Really simplified down, we can start to ask two questions to understand what a strategy is and how it guides what an organization is. So what is a strategy? We need to answer two questions to understand that. Corporate strategy we're talking about, right? Number one is asking the question and coming up with answers around where will we play, right? So a company selecting which market it's going to operate in, what products and services is it going to sell in to those organizations, to those areas, what regions is it going to apply its trade in, should it work on developing its current market, or should it seek new markets? Those kinds of questions. Question number two is, how will we win? So once we have decided where we will play as an organization, we need to think quite clearly about, okay, well, how will we win in these markets and areas and regions in which we have chosen to play? Once we've answered those two questions, we have, I suppose you could call it part A of a corporate strategy. Part B, and this is where learning and development practitioners start to become really, really, really important in the strategy process. Do we have the competencies and resources in place to win where we have chosen to play? And part C, can we play and win in those markets before our competitors do? Are we agile and responsive enough to take advantage of the opportunities presented to us before someone else does? And for me, this slide represents years of work for me. I will be honest with you. Through the course of study on an MBA, through reading hundreds of articles on strategy, I've managed to condense it down into one slide for you. Then we ask ourselves, okay, fine, but what is a good learning and development strategy? They are interlinked. Corporate strategy and learning strategy are very much interlinked. And if they aren't, it's our responsibility as learning and development practitioners to set up a learning and development strategy and make sure that it is closely aligned to the chosen corporate strategy. So Corporate strategy ends off with, can we play and win before our competitors do? Are we agile and responsive enough? Also asking the question, do we have the competencies and resources in place to win we have decided to play? We as learning and development practitioners start with, do we have the people competency, skills, and talents to win where we have chosen to play? A second question we ask, what are our skills, competencies, and gaps, and how do we plan to fill these? And number three, how will we know whether our learning interventions are effective in answering the how to win question? So you see that an approach to developing learning and development strategy really dovetails in nicely with corporate strategy. We're going to get into some more details around how to actually achieve this. But what we don't want is to have completely separate corporate strategies and learning and development strategies for our organization that don't speak to each other. What I'm talking about here is alignment. Are we able to get the two strategies aligned? If we are not, then either one of the strategies is going to have to change. And granted, us sitting here as learning and development professionals, we're probably not sitting on the boards of these companies. So it's probably going to be our learning and development strategy that will need to change. We're not going to get to necessarily change the corporate strategy. However, it is important for us to, where possible, take our voice and make our voice heard. That, okay, so Exco or board, you've asked us to execute on a particular strategy. These are the competencies and skills and talents we need to be able to win in the markets which we have chosen to play. We as L&D will help you to go and understand, well, what are the gaps between the skills and competencies that individuals and teams have in the organization and what skills they need to have in order for us to be successful. And we need budget to start to close that gap between what the skills are and what the skills are that we need to have in order to be successful. Is everyone clear so far? Thanks, Demola. So, I'd like for us to talk about the alignment of corporate people and L&D strategies. You will get these slides, but this is just a summary of the conversation that we've been having, right? So at the highest level in the organization, you've got your corporate strategy. We ask questions around where will we play, how will we win, does our culture support or detract from us winning where we have chosen to play, and how well are we set up for innovation, for example. Those are high-level strategic questions. Our people strategy at one level below is our broad people strategy. So what is our approach to attracting and retaining talent? That's a people strategy. Will we build talent or buy talent, or use a hybrid approach to win? Do we attract and retain the right kind of talent in the organization? So when we say build talent, will we provide people with training, or is the skills gap so wide that we actually need to recruit people in? What's our approach based on the skills gap analysis that we have done in the organization? If we say, okay, our focus is a hybrid approach, or we are going to just develop our pre-existing talent, we go on and develop our learning and development strategy. What kinds of interventions will we need to run to develop our people, to develop those skill sets which will allow the organization to win? Very, very importantly, do an audit. What kind of resources do we have at our disposal to be actually be able to roll out the chosen intervention? Do we have budget for this? If we are trying to move the organization into a new market in a new country. I'm not sure our one sales workshop is going to be enough to allow our salespeople to be successful in this particular market. Potentially, there's much more training and development interventions that will need to happen in order to allow those sales professionals to be successful in that market. Ghana and Kenya, for example, Ghana and Nigeria, for example, are really quite close together. I mean, there's Togo in between and Benin, I believe. So, because they are both in West Africa, does that mean that the Nigeria and Ghana telecoms market are the same? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So if we are wanting to move into a new market, we are going to have to build learning and development strategy that ties in with our corporate strategy and ensures that the training will really speak to the needs of that particular market. We can't just necessarily take our thinking and apply it in a new market. Whether that's from a strategy perspective, whether that's from a learning and development perspective, that's just not going to work. Adebayo, I see that your microphone is unmuted. Are you wanting to contribute to the discussion? I see he's gone. He's muted himself again. And then finally, in terms of this particular model that I put together for you, what are the results? What was the result of trying to align that corporate people and learning and development strategy? Was it successful? So was the learning and development strategy successful in that it helped the organization and its people to win? Or was there a problem with our strategy? How aligned were the two strategies? And did they speak to each other? Were they complementary of each other? This is a process that you can use to start to get that alignment between what you are told to do in terms of executing on a corporate strategy and what you can actually do with learning and development. So to a lesser extent, talent acquisition, but learning and development, or HR in particular. You can be the execution wing for the organization, helping people to execute on the chosen strategy by having a really well thought out, well developed learning and development strategy. This speaks to my point about agility. Right? So when we see things are going wrong with the strategy and our ability to be able to provide skills and competences to the business that will make it win where it's chosen to play, how rapidly can we make those changes? And when do we know that our approach needs to change? Again, as I mentioned, we might not be able to change the corporate strategy of the organization. But in terms of how it is executed, that is where we can have the most impact and the most change. Our ability to be able to agilely pivot away from what is not working and move towards trying something that might work is really, really important with this. There's no good in just trying to do things again and again and again that don't work just because we've always done things this way. For me, there's no sense in it. So my ask is for you as learning and development professionals, practitioners, HR practitioners, is to really get your voice. Take your voice. Get your voice and feel free to say, I don't believe that this is going to work. Here's my reasoning. Here's some of the data maybe that I've collected. Here's maybe what worked for other organizations and what didn't work. I believe that this is potentially misguided And this is what I believe we should do. It's about claiming voice, right? It's going to be easier or more difficult to do that depending on the organization that you are in and depending on the culture of the organization that you are in. So, I would like to mention something that is very close to my heart in terms of the progression of learning and development as a profession. Josh Burson is credited with the particular content that you see on your slide. He says quite clearly, and the research shows that not just L&D, but good L&D is transforming from being an order taker to a solution designer, right? This raises a critical point about how well the learning function is strategically integrated in the organization. And this is why the title of my presentation is that strategy and learning and development are at a crossroads. What does it mean to be at a crossroads? It means that we are going to make one of two decisions. Either we are going to continue to be an order taker, or we are going to pivot ourselves to be a solution designer, a people betterment solution designer inside of our organizations, which helps our organizations to execute on the chosen strategic path effectively. Why? So that the organization and its people can be successful and can win. You notice how I didn't necessarily mention the word profit. Profit is important for any organization, as is cash flow. These are incredibly important things. But having our people in a position to be productive, effective, and stay in the organization, it becomes increasingly more straightforward to start to build the business case for that kind of work. So yes, we are going to spend money on our people. With any learning and development function, intervention, system, structure, policy, we are going to spend money on our people. Very important for us to start to build the business case for why we want to teach these particular individuals or teams this particular set of skills. If that is not tied to the corporate strategy, then arguably we shouldn't be doing it. So, this transition, this crossroads, learning and development as order taker, and I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with this kind of situation. A line manager will come, and I mentioned it earlier when we talked about moving into a new market. A line manager might come to the learning and development manager or into the department and say, all right, our team needs team building, or our team has a skills gap that needs to be filled. Learning and development, put something together and give us dates and come and roll it out for our team. We don't know if that's even going to work. We are taking the work that we do and rolling it out in quite a reactive manner, like a waiter would do in a restaurant. Business comes and places an order with us. We deliver the training. We maybe push out an evaluation form, and then we don't see or hear from those other people that we've just delivered the training to until the next request comes through. For me, that is not a very strategic way to do learning and development. When learning and development practitioners start to move towards a solution design mindset, things can be very different. L&D stops being that one-stop shop for everything training related in a business. we say to ourselves, it's okay to challenge the line client's assumption that just more training is required. If a line client has identified a challenge, throwing training at that challenge is not necessarily the answer. Being a solution designer and partnering with business units to develop training that is tied to the strategy of the organization is what we mean when we say L&D should be a solution designer. What can this lead to? A real deep appreciation of those line client needs, of the strategic need, of not just any skills gaps, but the skills gaps that present a massive risk to the business with regards to the organization not being able to win in the space in which it has chosen to play. See how learning and development can become incredibly strategic, not just being an order taker. Easier said than done this. This is years of work. This is years of work building relationships with line clients, building relationships with your strategy office. Some organizations even have a strategy PMO, project management office. L&D practitioners, L&D directors, HR directors, doing their level best to get a seat at Exco to make sure that the people in learning and development strategies are taken seriously when it comes to the strategic decision-making process and putting together strategy for the next year, 3 years, 5 years, or whatever it is. We've got to fight for it, unfortunately. And again, as I mentioned, it's going to be easier in some organizations than others. Are we all clear? I think I have 2 more slides that I want to get through because I am eager for us to have a conversation and to answer any questions one or more of you might have. I'm very, very big on building business cases for things. If we want to get our projects up and off the ground, if we want to get budget and funding, we need to be able to speak the business of business, right? Does that make sense? We need to understand their language. We need to understand how they make decisions. Most accountants, definitely senior accountants, create business cases for making decisions, right? So we've got business case A and business case B. If the benefits of business case B outstrip the shortcomings or the drawbacks of business case B, we're going to go for business case B. We need to ask ourselves as learning and development practitioners, fine, we want to buy in a new learner management system, a new LXP. We want to buy a content library. We want to send our executives to business school X for this leadership development. Fine. But what is the business case for that? Are we clearly asking ourselves, okay, so I've looked at business school X's offerings. This is what the particular program that we'd like to send our senior leaders on offers. From a skills development perspective or competency development perspective. Is what the business school offering, is that allied and aligned to what we are trying to do as an organization? If we could say, yes, it is, then we've built the business case. If we have an incredibly small learning and development department or small HR department, and we are looking at a learner management system, how do we start to build the business case for that? You can sit in a meeting where LMS providers will come and pitch to you and promise you heaven and earth in terms of what their learner management system can do that others can't. But if you don't have a content library ready to upload onto that learner management system, then you haven't built the business case for purchasing that learner management system. And there's potentially some other platform that you would need to look at. If you're trying to get learning to occur at scale in your organization and you don't have the content, then why on earth would we be buying a learner management system? Just to take that as an example. So building a business case for what we do is incredibly important. Giving our decision makers, whether they be finance or the CEO, whoever it is, what is the hoped for return on this particular risk that we are taking, right? Because when we spend money on an LMS, send people on training, or hire a new learning and development manager, we take on a risk. What is the return of that risk going to be? Even if we can just start to estimate what the return of that will be, we can start to build those business cases. This will help us to articulate our strategy. Once we've made some strategic decisions around, okay, well, what skills and competencies are we going to develop? How are they linked to the strategy of the organization? And what are the different interventions we are going to run? This is how we start to build that business case for the learning and development strategy in and of itself. So we ask the question, what is the business case we are trying to build? Answer number one. One that demonstrates how effective learning and development can be to help the organization execute on its strategy effectively. And number two, learning and development itself has to develop and articulate an effective L&D strategy that is aligned to the corporate strategy in order to achieve the results mentioned in answer one. In order to achieve the results we envisioned for answer one, that is that a well thought out and developed learning and development strategy can help an organization to effectively execute on its strategy. I've given you some examples. They're very detailed. I'm not going to read through them all, but some examples of what learning and development can do to assist an organization to execute on its strategy effectively, right? So that the learning and development strategy is tied in with the corporate strategy and that we are speaking the same language and singing from the same hymn book, I believe is the expression. So what can L&D do? We can make sure that we are developing the right skills. What are the right skills? The skills are the skills that the organization needs now and into the future. So an effective L&D program, when I talk about program here, I'm not talking about specific learning interventions. I'm talking about the overall learning and development agenda. That's the L&D program for the year, quarter, 5 years, whatever it might be. Develop the right skills that the organization needs. What can L&D do to assist corporate strategy execution? L&D can work on improving employee engagement so that employees stay, so that the right employees stay, that they feel motivated, that they feel that they have what they need in order to do their job effectively, whether that is from a skills and training perspective, or a resourcing perspective, or a remuneration perspective. Our focus can and should be on improving employee engagement. Number three, learning and development is responsible for building a culture of continuous learning. Number four, aligning learning and development with organizational goals. We've been talking about all of these. Number five, improve return on investment and how we measure return on investment of the learning and development program. Again, whether that's over on an intervention basis or on a monthly or quarterly or annual basis. Think clearly about how we're going to demonstrate the return on investment with regards to the learning and development function and its interventions that have been run. And number 4, attract and retain talent. We've talked about this a lot. Are we going to build talent, or are we going to buy talent, or some combination thereof? Effective L&D can help us to attract and retain top talent by providing those opportunities for employees to learn and grow. So this right here is not an exhaustive list in terms of what learning and development can do to help an organization execute on its strategy. The key and probably the most important slide of my presentation is this one. How do we start to get alignment between the corporate strategy and the learning and development strategy? Number 1, it's to change our minds and mindsets away from being an order taker and much more closely towards being a solution designer, working with different stakeholders to design solutions that are going to work for the business, not against the business. What can we do to get that alignment? Number 1, involve the key stakeholders. Know who the stakeholders are. Take out a piece of paper and do a stakeholder map. Who are you going to need to engage with to ensure that learning and development is as effective as it can be to help the organization to execute on its chosen strategy? Number 2, are we understanding and using the strategy frameworks that our strategy is based on in our own strategic planning processes? We might not necessarily use their framework word for word, but we should definitely have a look at what framework they've used and see what we already have that is tied in to the strategy that has been developed and what we will need to develop in order to get that alignment right. So use a common framework. If the business is using OKR or balanced scorecard to design their strategy, should we not also be using OKR and a balanced scorecard to understand the effectiveness of the learning and development strategy and operations? Use your data and analytics. Many organizations are sitting on huge amounts of data and analytics. They're just not really using it. Use that data to start to understand what those skills gaps are and what the knowledge is that is needed to start to really create a very pointed approach to training, to understand clearly and help our stakeholders understand clearly what interventions it is that we are going to need to run. What we need to do is to make sure we align our learning initiatives with business objectives. We've talked about that a lot. Continuously monitor and evaluate, and communicate and foster that culture of learning. These are some of the things that we can start to do to get alignment right. And this is not going to be achieved within one day or 1 week or even 1 month. Even 1 year. This is a multi-year process and project. So that learning and development can start to deliver the value that it promises it can deliver. And it can do it. There are organizations who are doing this stuff. Some of them which I've been incredibly lucky enough to work with, some to work for, but many, many organizations are not getting this right. If anything, there is one thing that I'd like to see you do as L&D practitioners. That one thing, and this doesn't require budget, This just requires effort. One, involve those key stakeholders in the decision-making and planning process. That we can do. That we should do. All alignment activities require learning and development to be a solution designer rather than just an order taker. If we go in with the mindset of solution designer, we can start to really play a much more strategic and important role in our businesses. I'm done. Thank you very much for the opportunity for allowing me to present. More than happy to field any questions that you may have.